I would not have enough time to run a D&D game. That is true. I like to participate, although with, this being 2020, there hasn't been a D&D game for a while. I feel like working on open source has helped me in the sense that it opens opportunities for me when people find out that I work on open source, when they find out what project I've worked on. And so I've gotten to meet a lot of people. I've gotten to go give talks about xUnit that, those are things I probably wouldn't have been able to do had I not been working on xUnit. And in fact, I would say that I was more, getting out and getting on the speaking circuit was something that happened earlier for xUnit.net than later for me with ASP.NET. So by the time, I started doing talks for ASP.NET as well, I already had that experience, which is also very nice, that it helped me sort of get a jump start on that. But it certainly opens doors. I don't think it necessarily does that for everybody, but I do believe that, it can be helpful if for your career, for people to be able to look at a body of work that really is something that was driven just by you or just by you and a couple of friends, to be able to say, this was not driven by any corporate decisions. This was not driven by anything like that. It was really just us thinking about what do we want and interacting with the community. It can be a really useful tool for people to get an insight into how it is you interact with the community at large. There has been for me always a desire to be able to give something back to the community. And the open source that I work on is, an attempt to do that. My big project, which, most people probably know me for, xUnit.net, started out as an internal tool. And we really sort of lobbied to make that be available to everybody everywhere so that they could use it as well. So that's always been my primary driver for doing open source. I spend probably 1 day a week working on my open source projects on average. Sometimes it's a little bit more. Like right now, I'm trying to get version 3 out. And so I'm working mostly on Saturdays and Sundays right now. There will be times when I don't work at all on it during the week. And so I only work on it in my personal time. My day job is, my day job hours. So I only work on the weekends. The contribution model for xUnit really sort of falls into two camps. One, obviously, Jim Newkirk and I were the original founders of the project, so we have a lot of our own code in there. The vast majority of it is just code from us. And when we first went open source from Microsoft, it was really more of a shared source model. It wasn't really an open source model. Once the project got out of Microsoft's ownership into what was at the time the CodePlex Foundation, which became the Outer Curve Foundation, and then when that disappeared, went to the .NET Foundation. Basically, once it left Microsoft, we started taking, actual code contributions. And so there's really sort of the core team. Jim isn't involved so much anymore. So mostly it's me and Claire Novotny. She owns the Visual Studio runner and the devices runner, and I own pretty much everything else. And then from the outside community, most of the time, I would say the majority of the contributions we get are bug reports and feature requests through the issue tracker. And then we do get PRs. I'd say that those PRs come from a mix of places. There's a significant amount of contribution from a third-party perspective from teams at Microsoft, because there are a lot of teams at Microsoft that use xUnit. So the Roslyn team, the .NET team are a couple of big contributors. And then, just the general public, they see a feature they want, or they see one of our up for grabs issues on our repository, and they just grab it and do the PR. So from a core committer perspective, we've really probably only had 4 or 5 people over the years in that model. Obviously, me and Jim and Claire. Claire sort of joined us on V2 to add support for devices, because that's when we added more than just basically .NET Framework support. And then Marcin Debosch is somebody that I worked with at ASP.NET and a couple of other jobs. And we had written some Roslyn analyzers at one of our jobs together. and he expressed interest in writing what became the analyzers for xUnit.net. He's no longer maintaining that, but he did a tremendous job sort of getting it off on its feet. And so I sort of brought that back in. We don't really solicit for core contributors much. It's just, people who have made lots of contributions will generally sort of just take their contributions without too much fuss. But like people who have, just direct write access to the repos at this point, that's basically just me, Jim, and Claire. Version 1 lasted for about 5 or 6 years, I would say. We iterated on version 1, basically just doing minor version updates. At that time, and for version 2, we didn't really follow the semantic versioning model. From our perspective, we looked at major versions as major feature additions and major architectural overhauls. So in V2, we wanted to do cross-platform support. So that meant both adding support for other Windows-like platforms. So at the time, that was Silverlight, and then it became Windows Phone and UWP, but also being able to support running tests on Mono, both on Linux, Mac OS, but also on iOS and Android through Mono. And then the version 3 has really been yet another architectural sort of overhaul that was inspired by some limitations in our design that we discovered with .NET Core. And so just wanting to go back and make some big fundamental changes to some of those decisions we made. And again, that lasted about 5 or 6 years. So we didn't really plan those major versions, but once we understood that we were making those major version changes, we did go through and sort of make a plan for what was going to be included in those things. Along the minor version access, we just sort of take the feature requests and the bug requests as they come in. We collect them to the point where we think, hey, this amounts to enough to make a release, and then release them. So that part of it also feels a little bit ad hoc. But I think it's reactive to what the community is looking for from us. The support we get from the foundations has primarily been what I would call legal support. And that means a couple of things for us. One is the foundation helps us from a legal liability perspective, in the sense that they own the code, and if someone were to come and challenge the ownership of the code, it would be us and them together defending the code. But it also helps us from a legal perspective of contributions. Before we had the foundation, when things were in Microsoft, we really couldn't take contributions because Microsoft wasn't really set up at that point to be able to accept contributions to Microsoft-owned code. And so the foundation gave us the ability to set up a framework of contribution license agreements for code that's contributed. And what's really nice about the .NET Foundation version of that is, unlike when we were in the CodePlex / Outer Curve Foundation, everybody had to sign their own legal agreement for each project that was there. In the .NET Foundation, once you've signed a contribution agreement with the .NET Foundation, it applies to all the projects in the .NET Foundation. That's also very nice. So we have thousands, I'm sure, of people who've already signed that agreement who are basically legally ready and capable of making contributions. And that's a huge win for us. So the source code started out on CodePlex. I worked on CodePlex. I was there for the launch. Jim Newkirk, who is the other founder of xUnit.net, he also worked on NUnit, so unit testing was clearly something that's sort of in his DNA. We were both on CodePlex at the time. Jim ran the team, and I was one of the developers. And so we used it at CodePlex for CodePlex. So the source was on CodePlex even when it was a private project. Once it went public, at the time, CodePlex was the place that Microsoft was trying to focus its open source efforts. And so it lived on CodePlex quite a while until after we had moved out of Microsoft ownership and into probably the Outer Curve Foundation days. Once Jim and I left Microsoft in around 2012, we had then taken the opportunity to move the code from CodePlex to GitHub, which is where it lives today.